Thank you, Mr. Chair. Fellow panelists and distinguished audience, Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, and good evening. Good evening. Okay, let me continue by first saying that I'm still wondering why I'm here. Not because I've left academia and toxicology for quite a while now, almost a decade now. But coming from a politically not quite right, I mean from the other divide, I'm from the opposition by the way. I think all the more perhaps, I think you want to have a voice of dissent perhaps, to give it more, to give more dynamic to this discussion. And I think I'm quite sure that I'm not here to pretend that I understand all the agricultural issues that you are discussing, but I'm more coming from a perspective where I'm coming from would be a legislator, a lawmaker, an MP, member of parliament that has given all my thoughts and my attention to this issue of climatic change, global warming, and I would first make a mention that transforming agriculture in the face of climatic change and in view of securing food security and food sovereignty, to me, firstly begins with getting it right by way of the worldview. A worldview of what is finally development and what is finally growth. Until and unless you address that in all honesty, because from earlier speakers talking about not just shift, but as well making U-turn, I would first and foremost emphasize this point, that you will not get it right, until and unless there is this willingness to come face to face with the modality of growth. Because I believe it is the outcome of development that has brought about a direct impact on global warming. In Malaysia alone, the key greenhouse gases sources in Malaysia, in accordance to the 2007 statistic, firstly coming from energy, from waste. Second, from land use change, which is essentially due to the massive construction into property development and whatnot, what have you. Fourth, the industrial processes, and finally, agriculture. So put that in perspective. The total greenhouse gases, total emissions is 292.9 million tons. Sequestration by forests taken back 247 million tons. Net emissions is 49.9 million tons. Now, let me, without mincing my word, I think that is first and foremost a commitment to getting it right by way of modality of growth. And it is essentially, it must begin and it must premise itself on the issue of policy advocacy and policy framework and the legal framework subsequently. Now let me just keep very briefly as to reflect on what is going on in the parliament right now. We are now debating on the issue of our budget 2011 after the announcement of the 10 Malaysia plan, after the pronouncement on the government transformational program, after the announcement of the economic transformation plan, after the announcement of entry point project, after the announcement of the business opportunities, blah, blah, blah. There's a long acronym now that you're going to be familiar with Malaysia right now. that is the the in thing right now, and the acronym gets built up. But what is important to me is when I'm addressing this issue, I think this is quite related, directly and indirectly perhaps. Is when you address this issue of budgeting, incidentally, this budget is the first one crafted and designed according to a methodology called outcome-based budgeting. And if you have identified among the predicament that essentially, given our context, the Malaysian national economy, we are in a nutshell, if I can just put it briefly, we are an economy trapped for a decade in economic stagnation, essentially due to economic stagnation characterized by a middle income trap, due essentially to low productivity, caught in that low value added activities and industries. Now that is a diagnosis. That's what you aim to address. Nowhere in addressing that did you have at all categorically stated as to address the issue of carbon emission and what have you. So, okay, you may not put it and stipulate it as categorical as that, but somehow, if you look into how you have organized yourself by way of pursuing a 6% growth per annum and driving it through private investment, blah, blah, blah. But when you look into how capital is being, how budgeting is being done, fine, I must admit there are tax exemption to green technologies, green buildings, and of course, other things that are also addressing in a more tangential way on carbon emission. But when you come to the crux of it, in the final analysis, how much of emphasis by way of proportion of investment, spending and development, would you be emitting carbon or anything that relates to that, as opposed to one that is environmentally friendly? So, Mr. Chair, this would be perhaps my input in this discussion with all these distinguished gentlemen up here. I find that it is most pressing that leaders, because climatic change and global warming would have to be addressed in a multilateral fashion. It's got to be a global effort. We are a small GDP, we got a small economy, and especially where I come from. If you want me to address, I was first told that I'm going to be addressing things that are happening in Kuala Selagor. I mean, it's a drop in the ocean. It's so meaningless. But however, if leaders of all these nation states get it right by way of their direction, by way of the worldview, and addressing this, nationally, regionally, and transnationally, finally we are able to address this. But until and unless we are able and willing enough, we can go to international conference and talk about, reducing emission intensity of GDP by 40%. Copenhagen, my right honorable Prime Minister, with all my due respect. But when I come to analyze how much that would mean by way of reducing your economic activities, and especially you see this budget going for megalomania kind of construction and property back to Tun Mahathir's time, I have my fear. I have my fear. And I'm saying this from the bottom of my heart. I'm not running down the government. But I must say this. And academics here, all those who are responsible here, we must come together on a bipartisan basis to address the issue. And I think with that, I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Hey, thanks, Doc.